Welcome back to True Stories, where I sift through messages, voice notes, and old threads to bring you things people swore were real. My name is Mark, and I run this channel because every week someone sends a recording or a memory that does not sit right. I found a folder of submissions that had been archived, and for some reason I had never posted them. Maybe because they were too raw, maybe because I needed time to breathe. So today I pulled 10 of those that all share one terrifying thread, and I put them together in this episode. If anything you hear sounds familiar, tell me in the comments and say where you are from so we can see if patterns line up across the country. I will warn you now, the accounts get strange fast, and some of them are violent. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, pause and come back later, because these stories are meant to be felt, not rushed. What you are about to hear are first-person reports from folks who live out past the lights, in back roads and hollows, people who wake to dogs howling and find foot-shaped prints where no animal tracks should be. Tonight is about Dogman encounters that broke routines, cracked windows, and in a few cases left scars. If you have ever had something in the dark stare back at you from the woods, write down as much as you can below. All right. We start with a story from Southeast Ohio, a property outside of Marietta where the narrator says the dogs turned from protectors into prophets. The house belonged to a family of 5, and the voice on the recording belonged to Nathan, a 32-year-old who grew up on that land. He described the farm as flat in most places, but ringed by steep ridges and a creek that ran black in the fall and thin in the summer. On the night he first called, the sky was low and the moon was a pale coin. The domestic dogs, 2 blue tick hounds named Daisy and Ranger, began to bark together at midnight like they had learned a single new language. Nathan told me the sound was more like a chorus of warning than simple barking, and that the cadence made his skin crawl. He was alone that night because his wife Sarah had taken the twins to her mother's for the holiday. And when he got up to check the back pasture, he brought a flashlight, his old Winchester, and the weight of habit. He told the story in a voice that was calm in the way a person trained not to let panic win. He said the first sign was scent, a tang like copper and stale meat that grabbed at the back of his throat before he saw anything. He said he could hear the creek, but not the birds, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and diesel from his truck. He walked slow, boots pressing the sod, flashlight cutting a thin cone of light over grass. And the dogs pulled at their leashes so hard Nathan nearly fell. He opened the gate into the small wood and froze because he caught the reflection of something in the beam that should not have been there. He described white fur like a soaked canvas, long limbs that bent wrong at the knees, and a face too narrow to be a dog. He heard it breathe, a wet sound that smelled of iron and rot. He called out, "Hello," and the thing answered with a noise like a small man trying to bark. Dialogue followed that felt like bargaining. Nathan said, "You need to get out of here," and the thing made a sound like, "Yeah," and a soft chuckle that vibrated through the ground. Nathan shouted, "Back to the house now." And his old neighbor Tom, who had been sleeping 2 barns over, came out and said, "What in God is that?" And the thing stopped and cocked its head at the 2 men like it was deciding. Nathan asked, "What do you want from us?" And the neighbor called, "For the love of God, go inside and shut the doors." The creature suddenly ran along the ridge in a blur low to the ground, and the dogs went silent. Nathan said he felt his blood run cold, and the air seemed to press on his chest like someone put a hand there. Tom grabbed his shoulder and said, "Run," and they did, boots slapping the gravel, truck lights blind white, running back toward the farmhouse where the porch light felt like a small island of sanity. They got inside, bolted the doors, checked the windows, and found long scratches on the porch steps as if something had leaned on the wood and then stepped away. That night Nathan could not sleep. He lay with the rifle across his knees, and the sound of the dogs moving quietly on the floor felt like prayer. The next morning, however, the family found prints along the fence where the creature had lain. Prints that looked partly like a human foot, but with a deeper heel and the toes widely splayed, like long nails scraped through the dirt.
They showed the pictures to a local game warden named Joe, who insisted it was a bear at first, and then admitted bears do not paw like that. The family brought in a vet named Dr. Ellis, who said the wounds on a calf down by the creek looked as though something had torn at the hide with hands, not jaws. That was the first block of the night, and it put everyone on edge. The aftermath was complicated. For 2 weeks, the farm kept lights burning, and they slept in shifts. Neighbors like Aunt Clara and Ben came over with shotguns, and the sheriff put up a note
about strange sounds reported on the opposite ridge. The family installed motion lights and a cheap security camera near the barn, and on the footage, there was nothing until one late hour when a white smear passed too quickly for the camera to focus and left the image pixelated and wrong. Nathan told me he shot at it once, but the bullet sawed the air and sunk into the dirt where it left a blackened smell. He said it felt like throwing iron at a ghost. People in the community suggested coyotes, a deer with mange, or a prank, but the consensus frayed when other properties on the same road began to report similar things. That is where we pause for a second. If this first tale pulled at you, take a second and tell us in the comments whether you would have stayed on the property or left. Start your comment with "I would" and then say where you live so we can map responses. Those notes matter because when multiple people in one region report the same details, it moves this from a local freakout to something worth following. Now I will run 4 short vignettes that come from 3 different states. Each one is a quick account with names, sensory moments, and an ending that keeps breathing in your ear. First vignette comes from the Ozarks in Missouri, and the voice on the clip was a 17-year-old named Lewis who worked at a feed store in Baxter County. He told me he was on his way home after closing and that his truck had a flat on a lonely stretch of county road. He described the air as tasting like wet ash and that his phone had no bars. He said he sat on the tailgate and was fiddling with the spare when something moved in the ditch and 2 black eyes caught his light. He said, "I thought it was a stray dog until it stood up on 2 legs and its shoulders were wrong, like a man who had been stretched." Lewis called out, "Hey," and it cocked its head and stepped forward with long fingers dragging through the mud. He said he sounded human when he breathed. Then he made a sound like a rasping laugh, and I slammed the tailgate and drove off. The next day, he found 4 sets of deep, narrow prints in the mud near his truck. The second vignette is from a small town in Oklahoma where a retired game hunter named Joe described an attack on his herd. He named his nephew Marcus, who slept in the barn, and who woke to a smell of sulfur that made him gag. Marcus told Joe there was a shape when he lifted the lantern, a thing crouched like a dogman on its hind legs, eating the ear of a cow as if it were a snack. Marcus shot into the air, and the thing rose and ran, like a deer but taller, and left a scrape on the corral that listed like a fingernail. Joe said the hair on his arms stood up for weeks afterward. The third vignette is from northern Florida, where a young mother named Rachel heard her 2 Labradors howl as if attacked and found them cowering at the bedroom door with mouths bleeding. She went outside, and the air was so still she could hear the creak of her gate and the sound of something moving through palmetto leaves. She saw a white blur at the edge of the swamp, shining like bone under the moon, and the thing turned and showed eyes that were black and wet and reflective. She took pictures through the window, and one photo captured a pair of human-shaped hands on a tree trunk. The last short vignette comes from eastern Kentucky, where a college student named Caleb and 2 friends were out on an ATV when they hit a gully and the machine stalled. One of his friends, Olivia, went to check the spark plug and came back pale, saying something was watching from the ridge. They all heard it then, a long, high screech like metal dragged under water, and something ran between the pines with a long tail in the air. Someone shouted, "Run!" and the dogs that had been with them took off, howling until they were out of earshot. Those 4 small bursts are meant to tighten the rhythm and show these things do not respect property lines. They are often announced by smell or sound, and animals always react first. Now, the main feature. The flagship account comes from northern Wisconsin and is an extended recording sent by a man named Peter, who was 45 at the time and who had been a logger and part-time trapper most of his life. I asked him to give me a backstory, and he sent a voice note that lasted 7 minutes, slow and thoughtful. He described growing up on a ridge near Hayward, learning to skin a deer at 13 and to respect the quiet of the woods. He said his father Hank taught him to listen to the creek at night to know when weather changed, and his mother Ellen baked bread whenever someone came back with a hare. In his 20s, he fell in love with a woman named Mary, and they had a cabin 2 miles back from the state road where they raised a dog named Baxter and kept a couple of horses. Life was hard, honest, and shaped by the seasons. He said he believed in hunter's luck and in the modest geometry of traps and snares, and that he was not a man given to superstition. He told the voice that after Mary died in a hospital in Duluth, he sold some traps but kept the cabin because it was where her mug sat on the counter and the kitchen table still had the ring where a jar of sugar had sat. He went down the list of neighbors who checked on him, names he gave to me calmly because he wanted me to know these people were real. Aaron the mail carrier, Deputy Will who came by to check odd reports, Margot who ran the diner in town, and Darren who repaired his truck. The backstory ran 850 characters in his note, and it did what it needed to. It rooted him. The incident began one mid-October dusk when the sky was the color of old pennies and the maples along his access road were nearly bare. He had gone out to check a trap line and to fix a gate the cows sometimes force open. Baxter came with him. He said the woods smelled like cold metal and dried grass. The dogs on nearby farms began to raise their voices across the ridges, and at first he thought coyotes, but then he heard the low sound because he described it as a steady exhale like someone blowing through corrugated pipe. He stopped and said, "Can you give me a light?" and his neighbor, Aaron, from 100 yards away, flicked his torch. They both saw something there, half in the ditch, half on the road, and it was tall. The creature had shoulders like a man, but with the narrowness of a canine rib cage and legs that bent at wrong joints. Its ears were too high and angled, and the face was neither dog nor human. Peter said the smell hit first, a heavy iron and rot, and the air seemed to buzz as if insects had charged in a cloud. He described the color of the fur as the pallor of old bone, and that its eyes were like coins, wet and reflecting everything. Dialogue started between the 3 men like a bad attempt at calm. Peter said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" and the thing lifted its head and made a sound like a throat clearing. Aaron said, "Back away slow," and the creature stepped closer in a slow, curious gait and reached out to touch the hood of Peter's truck with fingers that ended in dark, curved nails. Peter said, "Move," and Aaron said, "I am not moving," and the creature seemed to smile with too many teeth. There were 6 exchanges, and you could hear the tension build like a rope pulled taut. Peter reported a moment when the creature sniffed the air and then barked once, a hollow barking that made the dogs in the distance stop. The creature then grabbed at Baxter, and the dog yelped and bit, but the thing's grip was through fur and seemed to avoid bone. Peter picked up a rock and hurled it. The creature turned like a pivot and ran into the tree line with a speed Peter compared to a deer, yet without the grace. They followed cautiously and found the underbrush shredded, a path that led to a deep hole in the ground hidden by root and grass where, Peter said, the smell of sulfur pooled like rain. He placed traps around the hole and consulted with Deputy Will, who advised extra caution. They set up a camera, and that first night it recorded a low figure slinking on 2 legs, and then nothing for 5 minutes until the camera overheated and cut to static. Peter went after it once at dawn with Darren, and the 3 men ended up on the path the creature had made and found that the earth itself was torn into clumps like something had dug in long fingers.
They followed a trail of hair matted with dark fluid to the edge of a frozen creek and saw markings on the ice like hands had dragged and sharpened claws had muttered over the surface. Peter said he shot into the air twice to scare it, and it answered by banging a tree so hard the bark fell away in a long strip, and he felt the shock in his bones. The moments of tension in this flagship account I will slow and describe because they matter. The first peak was the realization that the creature was not merely passing through. For 5 minutes after the initial sighting, the 3 men formed a triad with flashlights, and the thing watched them from 20 feet away, sniffing the air as if choosing which one to approach. The air at that moment felt metallic and thick, and components of sound shifted. The dogs in the distance went quiet, the creek muffled, and the pulse in Peter's ears seemed to match the thump of its paws. That section lasted roughly 560 characters in his original note, and he repeated that he had never felt silence like it. The second major moment came when Baxter was grabbed, a quick, violent contact that changed the fight from observation to defense. Peter described the sensation of cold hands on his dog's throat and the sound of fur being ripped. He said his whole body carried a taste of iron after that, and he found himself swinging a crowbar with a precision he did not expect. The exchange of shouts between Aaron and the creature filled the wood, and the creature answered with a keening that sounded almost human, and the dogs began to scream. That moment of physical threat lasted again in his recording around 550 characters and included details of the smell, the sticky cold feel of blood on Peter's knuckles, and the rasping breath the creature emitted. The third main peak happened days later when the camera footage showed the thing watching the house like a person pacing a porch, and Peter caught another glimpse through the binoculars of its face bared at the window. The porch light cast it in silhouette, and the eyes were reflective like wet glass. This produced a stretch of panic that changed how the family slept. After those nights, the community came together. Names like Margot, Deputy Will, Darren, Aaron, and a veterinarian named Sue appeared in Peter's notes as people who checked traps, repaired damage, and comforted him. Some tried to shoot it, others put up lights and hung bells along fence lines. They tracked damaged livestock and found scratch marks on gates pressed deep into wood, and sometimes there were hand-shaped scars on hides. There was a technical element in how they set patrols that Peter described in a clear, almost clinical voice. He explained how they baited traps with recently skinned meat to see if the animal would retrieve food without eating it, how they set up infrared cameras at 2-meter heights to catch a chest-level stance, and how they used pepper-based deterrence as a temporary measure. That procedural note ran about 340 characters and was important because it showed not only fear but method. In the end, the creature did not go away with a single confrontation. It continued to appear in bursts, usually near the creek at dusk. Peter said that 6 months later, he still checked each window before sleep, and that Baxter slept inside, never wanting to step across the threshold alone. The signature details in Peter's story lined up with the short vignettes: tall gait, reflective eyes, smell of iron or sulfur, animals in distress, and prints that looked between human and canine. Across these 10 reports, the same elements recur and make it harder to explain them away as bear or wolf behavior. We now move to 3 more quick accounts that set the tenor for the last part of the episode. In Arkansas, a mail carrier named Rosa said she once stopped her truck to pick up a fallen package and felt a presence so close that the air changed to cold and smelled of old meat. She looked up and saw a white shape in the ditch with shoulders that moved like it was listening. She drove away with her hands shaking and later that week found strange symbols etched into the mailbox post. In Tennessee, an amateur hunter named Hank and his teenage son Miguel chased a crashing sound through the undergrowth and found a mound of hair and a bone stripped clean as if some ritual had been performed. Miguel described the creature as clever because it had hidden the entrance to its lair with branches in a way that a wild animal would not bother to do. In Michigan, a man named Steve who kept sled dogs in the winter reported one morning that the lead dog had been left bloodless and that there were human handprints on the sled runners, as though someone had crawled along the top and inspected the team. Those accounts demonstrate a consistent behavioral pattern: observation, stalking, marking, and sometimes feeding. They also show that when domestic animals are injured, the human community
shifts into action. In most of these incidents, people did not call in paranormal investigators only because the first instinct was practical: guard the livestock, post lights, bring in the animals, and call a neighbor. But those acts of practicality often revealed something different than a simple predator. Now to the closing section and the epilogue spanning 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the first cluster of attacks. 1 month later, people like Nathan, Peter, and Rachel reported that the animals were jumpy and that sleep was disrupted across households. Nathan said he and Sarah kept the twins inside and bought motion alarm lights and sat with the curtains closed at night. He described the nights as having an undercurrent of static, a faint crackling in the wires that did not belong to any appliance. Sarah spoke to a neighbor named Ben, who said he had woken to the sound of tapping on the roof like fingernails, and that his shotgun had been missing a pellet where someone had tried to see under the eaves. Peter said he started to record at dusk and heard an odd low humming on the clips that was not wind. The community set a schedule where someone watched the road each night in pairs. Names like Aaron taking the first watch, Darren the second, and Margot bringing coffee at odd hours. The social pattern here is important because it shows how these events do not stop at the initial fright, but ripple outward into routines. 3 months later, the pattern changed. The attacks slowed in frequency, but grew in boldness. A neighboring farm reported that the creature had come to the porch and dragged something away, leaving a trail of hair and blood. Pets were recovered with deep punctures, and in one case, a child found a mangled fawn dumped near a gate. Local schools held meetings because parents like Rosa and Hank wanted a sense of safety for their children, and Deputy Wills started a log of sightings and asked folks to report immediately rather than wait. They set up a public group on a local forum, and a few threads gained traction on regional boards on Reddit, and an anonymous poster from 4chan uploaded a shaky night clip that showed a narrow white face blink at the camera before disappearing. That online attention brought discussion and worry, but also more reports, which made the local paper write a small piece that called it a rash of animal attacks without committing to a cause. 6 months later, some strange things settled and some did not. Nathan sold a cow that had been mutilated and bought a motion sensor lamp that cast an orange pool across the yard. His family started sleeping with phones set to record and once got audio of a low, repetitive sound that matched other people's recordings. Peter continued to trap, and the game warden suggested increased patrols. In one case, a hunter named Raoul shot at a thing he thought would be a big dog and later found that the pellet had lodged into a tree and the bark next to it had been scraped at a semicircle as if fingers had scraped at it. The scars on animals healed slowly, and some pets never fully recovered their trust. The community became quieter at night in some places, louder in others, as families put up motion lights and moved animals into sheds. The epilogue for many was not resolution, but a slow accommodation to the idea that something shared their land. In final reflection, these 10 accounts create a pattern too stubborn to ignore: a bipedal creature with canine and human features, a smell often compared to iron or rot, reflective eyes, abnormal prints, and a behavior that includes watching, marking, and sometimes attacking livestock or dogs. The witnesses are not thrill seekers. They are farmers, truck drivers, mothers, a mail carrier, a hunter, and a veteran who do not want to be afraid in their own yards. They reported their stories to small forums, to me by voice note, and to local officers, and there are technical details in many of their notes about camera placement, trap baiting, and light placement that show attempts at response rather than panic. If this whole episode proved anything, it is that community matters when weirdness shows up. Tell us in the comments which detail you found most unsettling, and begin with "I saw" or "I would" so we can compare notes. If you want deeper breakdowns of the best footage, I will follow up with an analysis episode.
For now, remember these are submissions from real people who wanted their voices heard, and names like Nathan, Sarah, Peter, Aaron, Rosa, Hank, Marcus, Rachel, and Raoul are the anchors that make these stories hard to dismiss. Some of them moved away, some kept the lights on, and some say they will never let their dogs out at night again. As a last line to carry with you, think about the quiet between the trees and the way animals react to things our eyes refuse to see. Subscribe to stay on these cases because sometimes silence is not absence, and sometimes a dog barks for a reason we do not yet understand.